Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I am joined by my good friend, Stephen Erikson. Hello, Steve.
Hello, AP. How are you?
I am doing very well.
Good.
Um, it's you know when we start these conversations, what people don't realize, like we sit and chat and we catch up on various things, and then as soon as I start recording, it's like, Steve, hello, how are you? And it's like, hello, AP, as if, oh, God, you've dragged me in to do another one of these things.
Well, that's the impression I want to convey. Yes,
The reluctant artist dragged from his garret.
exactly.
Um, so today, I've been doing a series of videos, as you well know,
Hmm.
talking about, I had been doing prologues, and then it was just looking at the openings of books to see what these openings were doing, why they were arresting our attention, how different authors were using different techniques to grab the viewer's eye, or the reader's eyes.
Hmm.
And there were two that we had chatted about and I thought would be interesting to share with everyone else. And one is the opening from Glenn Cook's The Black Company. Is it what's the first one of the Chronicles of the Black Company?
The Black Company, I think.
Yeah. So just the opening couple of paragraphs from it, and the other was from Steinbeck's Cannery Row,
Hmm.
which is obviously a very famous literary example. So we're slamming genre and literary writing together to go, yes, you can use the same techniques because genre writing is still writing. It is still literature.
And there's actually there's a point of comparison we can make on those, so we can talk about that as well.
Don't give the game away. It's all part of a cunning plan, Steve. It's meant to look spontaneous.
All right, I shall be as spontaneous as possible.
Well, to be perfect, it is relatively spontaneous because we haven't discussed the points that we're going to raise.
No, we haven't. No, we have no notes. We have taken no notes. No, we're just going to
What
look at it.
what are notes? The number of times that people have seen me do this, where I put the thing up on screen, I read it, and then I'm talking as I am reading things. You go, I don't have notes.
You know.
I I wish I was prepared enough to have notes in all of these things. But anyway, um, what will we just get started with the examples? Then
Sure.
talk through the examples, and then we can sort of wrap up with a general discussion about this. How's that sound?
Sounds good.
Okay, so bear with me as I put this up on the screen, and then let me know when it appears on your screen.
Yeah,
Okay,
here it is.
so this is the opening to Glenn Cook's The Black Company. So tell you what, why don't I read this one aloud? Yeah, you can do the next one.
Sure.
Um, there were prodigies important enough, One Eye says. We must blame ourselves for misinterpreting them. One Eye's handicap in no way impairs his marvelous hindsight. Lightning from a clear sky smote the necropolitan hill. One bolt struck the bronze plaque sealing the tomb of the Four Valaka, obliterating half the spell of confinement. It rained stones. Statues bled. Priests at several temples reported sacrificial victims without hearts or livers. One victim escaped after its bowels were opened and was not recaptured. At the Fork Barracks, where the urban cohorts were billeted, the image of two turned completely around. For 9 evenings running, 10 black vultures circled the bastion. Then one evicted the eagle which lived atop the paper tower. Astrologers refused readings, fearing for their lives. A mad soothsayer wandered the streets proclaiming the imminent end of the world. At the bastion, the eagle not only departed, the ivy on the outer ramparts withered and gave way to a creeper, which appeared black in all but the most intense sunlight. But that happens every year. Fools can make an omen out of anything in retrospect. I have to say, I do love this opening. I greatly enjoyed The Black Company, and part of it is the dry, sardonic
Hmm.
wit of the narrator Croker. Like, there were prodigies important enough, One Eye says. We must blame ourselves for misinterpreting them. One Eye's handicap in no way impairs his marvelous hindsight. Like, it's just dripping with sarcasm.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting because quite often when you see somebody who has elected to do first person, you start seeing I showing up absolutely all over the page. This is first person where the only indication of the first person is we.
Yeah.
That's it. And that is, to me, that's confident. That's once he's laid that down, we know that we're into a voice of a character with that one word. That's all we needed for the entire thing. And yes, you're right. It's extremely droll.
But it's the fact that, I mean, if you omitted the first paragraph and then that last line, you have
Mm.
a list of these strange and startling events, and they almost go over the top. Like they're right on that line of whether they're over the top or not. It's because it's hard to tell with fantasy sometimes what is being exaggerated or is clearly extreme. Because with fantasy, until you're accustomed to the world, you don't know the limits of that world. And so with the sacrificial victims running away with bits of themselves missing, something strange is clearly going on, but how abnormal is it? And it's only because of that framing of the fact that One Eye going, oh well, we just misinterpreted the signs. Oh gee, thanks. You think? And then at the end, fools can make an omen of anything in retrospect. And so you have that
Yeah,
wonderful looking back at it.
yeah, it's and the two middle paragraphs are so pretentious, right? So it becomes almost melodrama in terms of what's being described, and so you're realizing that these are all things that may or may not have happened, but in retrospect, they're all being put together as the list to indicate that trouble is coming.
And the other thing
And
is, oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, what he sets up here is just that. He sets things up and then he immediately undermines them. So he's presenting the world in one fashion, but then telling you that, don't take this too literally. So that there's an element of skepticism that's already present in this opening that we're going to see. And of course, we don't know the character's name yet, but when we do, it becomes perfectly obvious why he's named Croker.
But the other thing that I find interesting is the very opening line is the reported speech of One Eye.
Yeah.
There were prodigies important enough, One Eye says. So this is something that the narrator has been told. We must blame ourselves for misinterpreting them. And again, the implied thing is One Eye says. And
Mm.
then One Eye's handicap in no way impairs his marvel. And you can hear the sarcasm on the word marvelous. It's if it had been One Eye's handicap in no way impairs his hindsight. There still would have been that, oh yeah, because hindsight is 2020 being the expression. And if you only have one eye, it can't be 2020. It can only be 20. But the fact that it's marvelous because there is that exaggeration, that hyperbola attached to it, it clearly signals that joke. But then the next two paragraphs are again reported things that have happened, not things that
Mhm.
have been he has witnessed.
No.
And then we slip back into his commentary. But that happens every year. Fools can make an omen out of anything in retrospect. And we can see very clearly the difference between what he is being told, what has been reported to him, and what he is saying and how he is telling it. And just to show that so simply, three different modes of this narratorial style, all in the opening, and none of it feeling forced or artificial. It all flows from that voice, and yet we
Yeah.
can clearly see the different types of narration that are here.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very cool. It's a great opening.
Um, and just the combination of horror, because let's face it, some of the images and things being reported are quite horrific. Like this is dark, horrific stuff, but it's blended with humor. And in that, I think that sets up so much of what to expect from the Black Company as a book. that you have horror, you have fantasy, you have humor, but it is all of a certain type.
Yeah. I mean, there's plenty of world building going on here as well. We get a lot of parts of the city are basically being mapped out for us with specific details. Most of them are not only parts of the city ominous, but the activities are ominous. Like this is a fantasy world where sacrificial victims are being cut open. Um, you got a place called Necropolitan Hill. Well, that's not a pleasant place to visit, quite obviously. You got a tomb mentioned there, and then you got this strange Forbalaka, and we don't know what the hell that is. But there was a spell of confinement that actually was holding that thing in place, which is foreshadowing, obviously, what's going to come. And then some of the stuff like it rains stones. I mean, that's or statues bled. Those are actually elements that we could describe or have been used in our world for various events that are purported to have occurred.
Yeah, classical portents, classical omens.
Yes. Yeah, and that sort of we get that sort of reassurance because we've had weird things already thrown at us with Necropolitan Hill and Forbalaka. So he comes back with, as you say, familiar portents.
And again, I think part of it is that blend of, statues bled. That is a familiar portent or omen that we understand. And so because that follows immediately after the tomb of the four Valaka, then it rained stones, statues bled. It's placing the fantastic in sympathy with a recognizable but still fantastical event. And I think people overlook how clever that writing is.
Yeah, it's the case of if you're going to give us something strange, follow up with something familiar, so that we regain our balance. And it's not accidental. If you were to, obliterating half the spell of confinement, priests at several temples reported sacrificial victims without hearts or livers. That is, you're still caught in that unfamiliar place. But because he gives us those they're short sentences, right? And that's the other thing, that there's a lot of manipulation of sentence length here that is having a very conscious and specific effect.
And again, there are very few, with the exception of at the Fork Barracks, that sentence. That is one of the few long sentences. And then you get to that third paragraph, which has, again, one not very long, but again, one long sentence. Most of the rest of it is that pointed, matter of fact, this is the thing that happened. And it's relaying the information relatively concisely, if not with, a bit of turn of phrase, a little bit of color to the language. And so that, I think, leans into part of what Cook did. Not necessarily straight up what we would call journalistic prose, but taking a note of that matter-of-factness of journalistic writing and combining it with the literary.
Yeah, and there's placement going on here as well, because we've got the urban cohorts are billeted, so we know we're not part of the urban cohorts of this city. And then again, that sense of at least the narrator's familiarity with the image of Tukes, or whatever you want to call that thing, probably a god of some kind related to the barracks for some reason. So there's that kind of familiarity that he does not explain, right? He just drops it in. But then you got weird things like, for 9 evenings running, 10 black vultures. 9 and 10 is not, and then you go to 1 after with the next line, and that's again not accidental either, right? It's he's messing around with specific details, and to test that, you just say, for 2 evenings running, 15 black vultures, it changes everything, right? And then he does the callback in the third paragraph to the eagle, which I thought was really good.
Yeah, so there's a lot going on here in terms of blending the fantastic with, you know, vultures, eagles. Like we are familiar with these things. There's the blending of the fantastic with elements of the familiar, even if they are presented in a defamiliarized way, as a portent, as an omen. Um, there's the building out of the world with things like for Valaka, the image of Chu or however it's pronounced.
Yeah, and paper tower as well. Yeah.
The fact that one of the characters is called One Eye, which, you know, is not a natural name. And obviously, we find out more about this later on. Like a lot of this gets explained later on, but it's clearly the name for someone. And
Oh, yeah. Hold that for 1 second. Hold that thought. I'm going to be right back. All right. So you mentioned One Eye. I'm going to read an opening. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's a long paragraph. It's a page and a half. But I'll start of it. It was a bad time. Billy Boy Watkins was dead, and so was Frenchy Tucker. Billy Boy had died of fright, scared to death on the field of battle, and Frenchy Tucker had been shot through the nose. Bernie Lynn and Lieutenant Sidney Martin had died in tunnels. Pedersen was dead, and Rudy Chassler was dead. Buff was dead. Reddy Mix was dead. I won't continue. This is going after Cacciato, and this is, you know, one of the classic Vietnam War films. So when I see One Eye, that's what I'm seeing. And I immediately sort of picked up on the naming convention, which is coming right out of the Vietnam War.
I clear well, and for me, it's very difficult to say because when I read it now, because I know the book, I know it's that the soldier names, and obviously that's something that both you and Esselman used
Yep.
in the Malazan world. But I I can't remember if the first time when I looked at Glen Cook, did I look at this and think they might have been a tribal name? Because again, a lot of try to have descriptive names rather than what we think in terms of like abstract names. But it becomes very clear very quickly the type of naming convention that's being used and why it's being used and the influence. It's I keep looking at particularly the first book of the Black Company, and I just was so impressed with it because it was a different way of approaching fantasy from what I was used to.
Yeah, completely.
And yet it had all of the same elements I was used to seeing. It had fantastic creatures reference, like the four Valaka. So you had that fantastic element. It was building on omens and portents and strange things happening. Like there's the thing that you always see, that defamiliarization and the world building, the fantasy world building in the opening that's going to be explored to bring you into this fantasy world. The use of strange things like soothsayers we are used to now being referenced all the time in fantasy. Portents like eagles and things like that. All of these were none of these single things, apart from say for Valaka as a specific thing, but none of these were so radically departing from fantasy that I couldn't recognize them. But the way they were being relayed, that tone, that narrative style, the voice that Croker as narrator has, and the humor with which he is directing a lot of this, that very dry humor,
which is absolutely part of the Vietnam War literature, right? That droll understatement. It was almost sort of flattening out when horror is being described. I mean, I could have kept going in the opening of going after Cacciato, and it's just a list of the dead, basically, and how they all died. And so that kind of thing is sitting there. But the other thing I noticed about the eagle evicted from top of the paper tower, of course, that's kind of a reference to the Tower of London, isn't it? I mean, that's kind of what we're picking up there. That when the ravens are flee the Tower of London, that's all hell's going to break loose.
The eagle is usually associated with the ruler. It's the noble bird, and it's the 10 black vultures. And why 10? How many ringwraiths were there? But well, there weren't 10 of them, but you get that sense that maybe these numbers like 9 and 10 have meaning for that. And vultures do not have the world's greatest reputation.
Mm.
They're not known as noble birds. You know, and they fulfill a very important function in nature. But vultures don't have a great reputation. And
No, they usually they show up to mark imminent death, right?
uh,
So yeah, it's good.
um, and the fact that they are evicting the noble bird. But then
Mm.
it's the fact that it's the paper tar, a tar
Yeah.
made of paper that is so fragile, so insubstantial that there are all these little things worked into it, and I genuinely enjoy this.
Yeah. I mean, even word choice, right? If you wrote, then one chased away the eagle which lived atop the paper tower, it just does not work as well as evicted, right? It's just a perfect choice of word.
Because forcibly removed and then took
Yeah.
up and prevented residence. You know, it has all of those connotations because it's evicted rather than chased away, which means temporarily moved.
Yeah.
Evicted is no, you're gone. You no longer are a resident here. And there's an element of force to eviction,
Yeah.
an external force, in fact. But I, I'm sure that we could probably go through a lot more of this, but I think that gives a sense not only of Glenn Cook's opening, sorry, the opening of the Black Company, not Glenn Cook's opening. That would be something entirely different.
There's some nice alliteration going on throughout this as well. Um, in fact, if you start looking, you see alliteration everywhere, right? Prodigy's importance, bolt and bronze. Um, you got bolt, bronze obliterating, uh, really quite nicely done. What was the other one I noticed? Evicted the eagle, of course, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's subtle, but it's there. Refused readings,
Yeah.
fearing for, wandered and world. Um, yeah, it's nice writing.
Um, you know, and but also it's a blend between you have the Forvalaka, strange fantasy-like creature, natural phenomenon like the stones and the statue's blade.
Mm.
So that's a natural and man-made aspect. Then you have human actions like the priests and their victims. Then you have another visual thing. Then you have the birds, the vultures, and the. But then it gets down to and the ivy withered and gave way to a
Mhm.
creeper. So it's like all these different aspects of the world. It's not just the sky. It's not just what's happening on the ground. It's not just plants. It's not just animals. It's everything all together in this area. Um, it it's almost
Yeah,
you could almost say it's a scattershot approach, except it is so clearly deliberate.
yeah, yeah.
So let's move on to the second example, and this is of it, Cannery Row by John Steinbeck. So Steve, why don't you read this one?
Cannery Row in Monterey in California is a poem, a stink, a grating noise, a quality of light, a tone, a habit, a nostalgia, a dream. Cannery Row is the gathered and scattered, tin and iron and rust and splintered wood, chipped pavement and weedy lots and junk heaps, sardine canneries of corrugated iron, honky-tonks, restaurants and whorehouses, and little crowded groceries and laboratories and flop houses. Its inhabitants are, as the man once said, whores, pimps, gamblers, and sons of bitches, by which he meant everybody. Had the man looked through another peephole, he might have said, saints and angels and martyrs and holy men, and he would have meant the same thing.
And this when we had previously talked like quite some time ago about the openings of books that impressed us or had left an impression on us, like this was one that you had mentioned left an impression on you.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Um,
No, it's brilliant. But I mean, at the same time, I see a similarity in use of voice between the two samples we're using here. Um, there's a very, very firm position that this is proceeding from. It's one of great familiarity, and it's moving past well, I mean, it uses the physical details to evoke a particular emotion. And Glenn Cook was doing the same thing in the Black Company. So that's one of the similarities I'm seeing between the two.
It, there's an interesting thing just in the opening one, two, three, four, five, opening six words, and it's almost the opposite of what people typically do.
Yep.
Because here we start with Cannery Row, the specific street in Monterey. So we've gone out to the area. In California, we've gone out again to the state. So it's almost like the camera has started on the street level and zoomed all the way out to show you where this place is. Usually, you would expect in California, in Monterey, on Cannery Row, and the bringing you down onto the street level. And I thought the first time I saw this, I went, "That's the wrong way round. That's not right. It should be drawing us down into it." And
Well,
then,
we'll reverse it and see how it still fits with the sentence. It doesn't fit anymore, right?
but one of the reasons why I think it works the way that it is, and what I would suspect that Steinbeck was maybe doing, and I could be wrong, is that by going from Cannery Row to Monterey to California, that zooming out, it universalizes the human experience that we are about to walk through and see and meet on Cannery Row. That Cannery Row is being universalized. That although it is a specific place, this is about the human experience, and so that's why Cannery Row is an example of Monterey, which is an example of California. It is universalizing that one specific experience and bringing us to it. But that would be, my interpretation of why you would do it that way in terms of focus.
Yeah, I mean, there may also be an element of info dump, dare I say it, right? Because if you just said Cannery Row is a poem of stink, a grating noise, at some point you're going to have to elaborate to the extent of where is Cannery Row? Where do we place it geographically? Because, I mean, it could be anywhere on the US West Coast. But unless you know about the place, then you're left floating a little bit if you did not have the specifics of Monterey and California thrown in there.
And then that whole sequence of the initial descriptors is this wonderful, not quite seesaw, not quite positive now, but it moves between abstract and specific, positive and negative, that it is playing with how do you describe the atmosphere of a complex system and experience. And it's as if the narrator is struggling to come up with, I need to tell you what Cannery Row is. How can I describe the indescribable? And that's, a poem.
Yeah.
What is it? What do you mean Cannery Row is a poem? Like, if you thought about it in terms of specifics, like, what does that even mean? And yet, because it's part of this, a poem, a stink, a grating noise, a quality of light, a tone, a habit, a nostalgia, a dream, and it ends on the most aspirational and ethereal. So it begins with something quite abstract, a poem, even though it is a specific thing, but it ends on a really ethereal note that you cannot pin down a dream. You can't really pin down nostalgia. All of these things are difficult to pin down.
Yeah, and I think what he does is it's elliptical, because as you say, the poem is it's an abstraction, and so is a dream. So he comes back around to it in a sense, because poem and dream are more closely related than any of the other ones, and that's a nice sort of wrap up. And then you almost get a reversal of that, because then the next line starts with Cannery Row again. So he's coming at it, with sort of more detail as he continues, but he keeps it simple, right? He could have said the place is the gather, or whatever, the neighborhood is the gathered. That doesn't work, right? You got to hammer down that name again, because it's the name of the novel for one thing, but it's what everything is about. So
So that the first Cannery Row gives us the location in Monterey in California. It gives us a list of these kind of abstract and semi-abstract notions, which we really require context to try to understand what it is meant to mean. And then it moves to the far more, well, it starts moving towards the specific because it is the gathered and the scattered. Again, that is still kind of abstract. It's the gathered and scattered. So it is a place of contradiction. And then it moves on to much more specific tin and iron, neither of which are, it's not gold and silver, it's not platinum, it's not jewels, it's
No.
tin and iron, but then also rust and splintered wood, chipped pavement, weedy lots, junk heaps. This is a rundown, well worn, but also in some respects feeling not necessarily cheap, but certainly not extravagantly.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and it's poetic, obviously, as soon as he starts up. So he gives proof to his statement simply in the style he's using. The gathered and scattered is nice. Tin and iron and rust. So you're playing with how the mouth moves and how the tongue moves with each of the words.
And one of the things that I like here is it starts quite like gathered and scattered. That's kind of abstract. You don't know what they're talking about. Then tin and iron, and you go again. It's isolating general types that things are made of, but without being specific about what it is that you're looking at. It's I recognize materials, and then it becomes rust and splintered wood. Then it's chipped pavement. So we start moving in now into specifics. Chipped pavement, weedy lots, and junk heaps. That now we're getting an idea where this tin and iron and rust and splintered wood, where it's being seen. And then it moves on to the sardine canneries of corrugated iron. So there's your stink. Honky tonks, restaurants, and whorehouses. And I love the fact that restaurants and whorehouses are combined.
Yeah.
And little crowded groceries and laboratories and flop houses. And again, there's the combination there. So it's Steinbeck's not afraid to use an Oxford comma when he so desires.
Let's talk about commas here because he is not using commas in the places where he wants the rhythm of the sentence to actually carry across. So you've got tin and iron and rust and splintered wood. You could have done tin and iron, comma, and rust, comma, and splintered wood, which just messes the entire, rhythm of the sentence. Chip pavement and weedy lots and junk heaps. So, yeah, he's walking you through Cannery Row right here with these lines. But there's the one that jumps out, laboratories. That doesn't fit with any of the rest of it at all. But it's foreshadowing, the main character, Doc. Or a main character, I guess. I don't know. I mean, Cannery Row is the main character, but Doc is certainly one of the principal players. So that one, yeah, I mean, that's the one that sort of goes, what? What do you mean laboratories? It doesn't make any sense. But I really like that because it does set things up later.
What is that? One of these things is not like the others.
Yeah, no kidding.
But that's, and again, it's we sometimes talk about, you have to make everything seamless, you have to make everything fit in, but by throwing something in that stands out like that, you draw attention to it. If that is the effect that you are going for, knowing how to do that is important. It's when people don't notice when they have done that, and they go, why doesn't this feel smooth?
Well, it's also he could have said labs, right? That would have flowed much more seamlessly. But laboratories, just enunciating it in your mind makes you stop on it.
It's too many syllables.
Yeah, it makes you stop because nothing else fits that.
So it stands out. But again, like as you had pointed out, that the use of commas, it's not that the use of commas is inconsistent. It's that they are being used for an effect.
Yeah, it's selective use.
And that, again, that is something like, unless you were, I'm sure people have experienced this with a copy editor going through and go, that's not the correct use. Yes. The idea of correct use is very, very important. But sometimes creative writing is artistic expression, not about correct use.
I have to tell you, that's what's driving me crazy right now with the latest version of Word, because it keeps, it would be putting commas all through this thing, and that's just driving me crazy as I write, because it highlights these things as grammatic errors, and they're not. It's about rhythm, it's about style, it's about all these things. So,
and yet at the same time, if you just used commas willy-nilly, if you just had them like as if you had loaded up some sort of blunderbuss full of punctuation and just fired it at a paragraph, you don't want that.
no, and it seems that's what the program actually wants now. The word processing, editing functions, and it really is driving me mad.
And that's when you read this aloud, you realize that those commas are very specifically placed. And so what initially, if you were just looking at it, you'd go, oh, well, that's strange that there's sometimes a comma, there's sometimes an Oxford comma, and sometimes there isn't. You then go, well, okay, what's that drawing my attention to? Why are those things like that? And then if you read it aloud, you get into that rhythm. And
it's the rhythm.
It's the walking through and the initial recognition of what things look like, the materials, then the chipped pavement and the weedy lots, and then we start getting into what is specific. We can actually see these things, the canneries, the honky tonks, the restaurants, that we start naming that. It's as if we are now walking through the actual street. That we started on the outskirts with the weedy lots and the junk heaps on the outskirts. And now we've walked down into the main area where these things are.
Mm.
So there's a very deliberate feeling to this. And even then, the order of what we encounter, the place of work, place of relaxation, followed by food, a little bit more relaxation, pick up your stuff on the way home, and then you're back to your flop house at the end of the night.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, you're definitely moving through. Yeah. And so I mean, there might be editors that, if they didn't know this work, might call this purple prose, ironically. Right? You've got splintered wood, you've got chip pavement, you've got weedy lots, you've got junk heaps, as opposed to, wood, pavement, lots, and heaps. Right? So it's all down to it has to, when you're writing this thing, something like this out, you got to be able to trust in yourself that what's going to flow out is actually okay. And sometimes the editing side of things can actually get in the way of that. And I mean, the weird thing is, I'm finding that now with an AI driven editor that's trying to work my stuff, and it's just, it's infuriating.
Yeah, and you thought an AP driven editor was infuriating.
Yeah.
Not as bad as an AI.
You're nothing compared to the AI editor.
But of course, like, one of the clues to understanding that is the very first thing that we are told about Cannery Row is it's a poem.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is in that opening. It is in the opening line. Cannery Row is a poem. If you're reading this as straightforward, stripped down prose, you're going to run into problems.
Yep.
But it's clear that not everything is done that way, because again, its inhabitants are, as the man once said, and it's a list of, like, these are much more straightforward descriptions, because it's not attaching adjectives to every noun.
No, but what's interesting about that is the voice is being positioned here. The voice is not the man, right? The man is understood as the, I don't know what you would call it, the authority, the hierarchy, all of these things that are then passing judgment on this place. And so clearly the narrator is not the man, right?
And the fact that the judgment from on high is of this area is full of degenerates. And everyone in the area is a degenerate. And yet the narrator is then sort of pleading with, saying, had the man looked through another peephole, and it's interesting, it's peephole. The
Yeah.
man is spying on the people here. He might have said saints and angels and martyrs and holy men, and he would have meant the same thing.
Mm.
That the inhabitants are all of these degenerates, but they're also the opposite because that's the complexity of the human condition.
Yeah,
We
and
are
it's surprisingly forgiving of the man as well with this line, which is actually reflects back on the narrator's voice and tells you that this narrator is in love with Cannery Row and everyone in it, and that that gets played out in the course of the story.
but it's I do love the fact that the if he had looked through another peephole, and
Mm.
it's that voyeuristic aspect of like you're looking at it externally, you're spying on these people, you don't know these people, you haven't lived among these people, you're looking at them as some sort of voyeur and judging them.
Yeah.
And there's a seediness to that that actually the
Oh,
inhabitants
absolutely.
don't have.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Wonderful stuff.
okay. So, like those, in some respects, those are two very radically different opening. Like one classic literature, another dark, gritty fantasy, heavily influenced by Vietnam and Korean War fiction.
Yeah. Yeah. But there's something that links them to me tonally. It's the authority of the voice. It is there in both. It's in both. So.
Um, and so I think one of the things, particularly in some of the uh, openings to books that I've been looking at recently, there's been one of the linking elements to a lot of them is a very strong narratorial voice or tone. That there's something to it that it is really, really distinct. And yet, so much writing advice that is bandied around is about paring all of that back, making your prose almost as bland as possible so that your voice isn't interfering with it. And yet, the the power of having someone tell a story in a certain way, and yet, like,
Yeah.
I'm not getting into a whole thing about show and tell. I'm talking about telling a story as in a story being narrated in a certain way, even if they are using show and not tell. But
Mm-hmm.
if it is being narrated in a certain way, having a powerful voice do that, or a very distinct voice do that, can be such a wonderful tool. It gives a genuine sense of individuality and identity and uniqueness to a text that it
Yeah.
isn't just
Yeah.
one more.
And I think it makes the reader confident in that narrative voice. It carries that authority that um, you just get a sense that this person, this narrator, knows their business. And I think Cook pulls it off both in the relationships of the characters, and at this point we've only got One Eye and whoever we, the other part of we. But there's a kind of a relationship being established between the two that involves a fair degree of skepticism and irony. And then with Steinbeck and Cannery Row, it's just a love poem to Cannery Row, and um, and yet it has sufficient details to tell you that this is a narrator who knows this place backwards and forwards. And if you read his, if you know about Steinbeck, yeah, he lived there, and he knew Doc, and so all of this is got that level of experience that is informing the language and the descriptions all the way through that,
But
and that
even
just
given,
carries a lot.
yeah, but even given Steinbeck's clear affection for Cannery Row, it's not blind affection. It's a Cannery,
Yeah.
no, it's a stink. Like there's a negativity in it, but it's all part of the experience, a lived in, understood experience. And like you said, when you have those distinct voices that are absolutely certain in how they're telling
Yeah.
you something, that command is very reassuring.
Absolutely, yeah. And of course, he does drop in the word nostalgia in that opening sections. So to me, that's a signpost that, yeah, okay, there's going to be elements of nostalgia built into this.
Yeah,
Um,
that rose tinted coloration to some things, the softening of the edges. But
yeah,
even then, the edges are still present. Like he isn't misrepresenting how run down it is, or the fact
no,
that, you know what, yeah, there are disreputable people here, and
yeah,
not everything is above board. But
yeah. And it's interesting because I've seen the film adaptation, and I'm one of the few people who absolutely adores the film adaptation that starred Nick Nolte as Doc and Deborah Winger, and it was a blending of Cannery Row and Sweet Thursday by Steinbeck into this film that was basically a love story between the two characters, and it's almost magic realism in the way the cinematography and the camera work and the lighting, and I just thought that it's a fantastic homage to Steinbeck, even though it's not specifically the storyline of Cannery Row. But I'm rare in that respect. I think there was lawsuits involved with that thing that limited its distribution. So
uh, but it again, and it's curious that like a lot of the writing advice that you get online, it is solid advice for the specific type of writing maybe that person's talking about. But quite frequently I see with writing advice that people are universalizing it, that they go, this author or this person said this thing, so that is what the rule is. And you go, but they were talking about it in a certain context.
yeah,
and and you can, there are very, I don't think there are any concrete rules that apply to all writing.
no, sufficient authority in that voice can break every rule. I mean, we've been discussing George MacDonald Fraser's opening of the Pirates that you're reluctant to do because it's what, a page and a half sentence
It,
long, a single
well,
sentence.
it's a page and a half, one giant
Ellipses.
long paragraph that ends in an ellipsis
Yeah,
and then carries on in the next paragraph. So technically, the first sentence is about two full pages of
yeah,
solid text.
yeah, which is
And,
absolutely brilliant, right?
and
And he conveys so much in that. His knowledge of the world that he is talking about, his historical knowledge, is just phenomenal in there.
and like we see that, we saw that in Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. That again, it was this long, long list of, in that case, juxtaposed, absurd, attenuated, exaggerated binaries, these
Mhm.
dyadic, hyperbolic dyads, and both he and, uh, in the Pirates, they use the same joke. I've seen this done so many times when people do this. Anytime you see one of these really long openings where it's either a really, really long sentence or it's a long rambling opening,
Mm.
count the number of times that somewhere it goes, in short,
Yes.
as the author knowingly goes, uh-huh, you thought that was long? So in short, and then they carry on, and you just go, you're just messing with me now, aren't you? And
Sort of crackpot trail style, right? Yeah.
that's
In
it.
summary. Yeah.
Um, and that's the thing. It's this George MacDonald Fraser, Charles Dickens. This is not a new literary joke, and yet it works every time.
Yeah.
I laugh every time because they are well aware this is not how you open a story,
No.
because this is breaking the rule. And then it's, in short, wink, wink. So it is the direct wink at the reader. And then
Yeah.
it's the, but now I'm going to carry on and do more. And you just, that,
Yeah.
that is a playfulness with text. And it's not that the author is disregarding or ignoring the reader's needs. That is having full confidence in your
Mhm.
reader. It's not that the author does not care about the reader. Far from it. It's the author is going, I respect my reader so much. I know they're
Mhm.
going to get this joke because they are well read, because they get this. And
Yeah, I sometimes wonder if that adherence, that sort of insistence on, oh, you need that hook in the first two lines, is actually disrespecting the reader.
not necessarily disrespecting, but I think we underestimate. I think
Underestimating them.
I think we underestimate readers. We underestimate a reader's willingness to spend at least a few pages to see how a book unfolds. If you're browsing in a bookshop and you pick up a book, you can read through the first page and maybe the next page. It doesn't take 2 minutes. It's less than 2 minutes to read through a couple of pages.
Mm.
And that's before they've even bought the book. And you go, you know what? There's something here. There's something I might like. So yeah, I can understand saying have something that is making your writing stand out. And it could be tone, it could be style, it could be a joke, it could be some narrative action, it could be something shocking happening. Like there are so many different ways to do it. I can understand that. But so frequently, we actually get book recommendations from friends. We aren't just randomly standing in a bookstore going, I'm going to have a look at this book. That people said, oh, if you read this by so and so, so you go, you pick it up, you have a look, and go, you know what? Maybe I don't see it in this first couple of pages, but my friend has recommended it. Friend recommendations have a strong power.
Yeah.
I think this mythical reader that has attention deficit disorder and needs everything done in the first three sentences.
Oh, it's got to be the elevator pitch, right?
It's
Yeah,
elevator pitch is for TV and film.
I know.
Headlines and the lead in the first part, that's journalism. That's because
Journalism.
studies have shown that when people are looking at a newspaper, they read the headline, and it was something like 80% of people read the summary, the bolded summary
Yeah.
beneath the headline. And then
And
it's
then they
down to
skip
something
to
like
the end.
50% read the first paragraph. And by the time you get to the second paragraph, you're down to something ridiculous like 15%. That's
Mm.
the drop off. That's not what book readers do.
No.
Book readers are not, it's not the I want a summary of what happens. Book readers are picking up a book to read. So
Yeah.
I don't know, someone needs to do an actual study on it, but because, our personal preferences, tastes, and experience can vary wildly from what actually happens. But like my gut reaction to this is we are underestimating readers.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
we are assuming that what works in journalism and what works in advertising and what works in marketing is what we want in literature.
Yeah. Weird, eh?
And you go, but even then, advertising and marketing and journalism, they all have their own variations. Essay writing, making an argument in an essay is structured differently to how you make an argument in law, in
Yeah.
examination and cross-examination. You go, you don't say all arguments have to be. That would be absolutely ludicrous, because in law is clearly the difference, is clearly very different to a lot of the arguments that you make in academia.
Mm-hmm.
But apparently, for writing, we have to treat everything as a bloody sales pitch in the first paragraph.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is to me absurd. And these are good examples. So, I mean, and yet at the same time, there's something about these samples that you've used that are arresting. I mean, they capture interest, but they're not doing it with a sledgehammer over your head, right?
But it's even when I looked at was it White Fang and Jack London, the
Mm.
barren landscape, an entire paragraph devoted to describing the barren landscape in all these different ways, and you go, it's a barren landscape. Why? What's with the purple prose? Well, actually, it's white prose because everything's frosted. But what's with the purple prose? Why are you spending so much time describing? Because the landscape is important.
Mm.
It's important.
Yeah.
It's so atmospheric and evocative. With Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, if you don't understand the dry social satire, piercing wit of that opening statement,
No
yes,
kidding.
the book is a romance. Yes, the book is going to have these things, but you are missing so much if you don't understand the humor in that opening. And it's that opening that is so arresting. Not the fact that, you know, a man in possession of a good fortune is in want of a wife. And you go, like, if you read that literally without that, you go, oh, really? And that's what this book's got. I just go, you're missing the point. Literal reading of things, just focusing on, well, this is the thing that was said. How it is being said sometimes can be so incredibly important. Yeah. It provides humor, tone, context, whether or not you're to take the information seriously or whether you're to doubt it, to show that someone is unreliable. Like we have with Steinbeck here. He is slightly unreliable. He's admitting it's a dream. It's a nostalgia. This isn't realism. This isn't a factual account. It is filtered. Yeah. And all these things, depending on the narrative, can be so incredibly important. And writing advice that is, oh no, you must do X. I have to admit, like when I hear that, it is usually when people are repeating what someone else has said. And I sort of go, well, let me go back to the source. And quite often when I go back to the source of where this person heard it, that's not what the person said. That's taking something of what they had said out of the context in which they were saying it, where they go, you know, if you're writing X type of novel and you're trying to achieve this, then one of the things that you should do is this, because that does that. And they've come away and they've remembered as, you should do this. It's not as simple and as dried and clear cut as that. In the modern fantasy genre, if you are aiming to sell X copies to X audience and you're trying to do this, what is currently popular in the style that people are going for is Y. So if you do that, that's currently what is popular, and maybe you'll get that. But if you write it differently, your book is going to stand out rather than be seen as yet one more of these things. Find your own distinct style, find your own distinct voice, find your own story. But again, no one wants an incredibly boring start to a book. Unless it's told in a way that's interesting. And if you have a really interesting start to something happening, it doesn't need to be, it can be told in a relatively simple and straightforward way.
Sure.
Yeah. It's about balance. It's about understanding what is there. Not, this is the thing that you have to do, which I think people misunderstand. They half hear writing advice, or they take away a suggestion, a piece of guidance, and they take it away as a rule, and then perpetuate it, propagate it as a rule to other people. But yeah, I think we underestimate modern readers.
Yeah, I think we do too. But it may end up ultimately as self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If you know, all the texts, you know, all the novels start appearing, they all start looking the same, and approach the reader as if they're, you know, 14 years old, then, you know, that's going to be the level of reading, and that's a bit of a shame. But you know,
we've seen part of that with cinema. The rising dominance of franchise in cinema has led to franchises being seen as the major cinematic form, and because of that, the patterns that they use, which it's because they're part of a franchise, that they have a tone and a style and a thing that they are trying to make recognizable as their brand. But now when a film deviates from that, if they do something, it's like, oh well, that's no good, it doesn't do this thing. You're like, but films don't have to do that thing. No, but that's what I was expecting. And you go, well, that's on you. Why were you expecting it to do that thing? Oh well, because that's what films do. You go, no, they don't.
No.
There's been some discussion both of Knives Out and the sequel Glass Onion.
Loved them.
And some people have gone, oh, Glass Onion's a terrible film because it's not It doesn't do murder mystery the proper way.
Oh
And
man.
if you go, I'm I no, I honestly don't know where you're coming from, because I can think of Agatha Christie mysteries. I can think of
That's what it refers to more directly than anything else is Agatha Christie. So
and and Agatha Christie has such a wide range and style of different ways that she did murder mystery. And yet people are going, no, it must fall. You go, no. And oh, well, you can't do that thing. You go, well, Columbo did that thing.
yeah.
Wait, we have an entire famous TV show that did the thing that you say that murder mysteries don't do. And
Mm.
oh, look, does Sherlock Holmes always do that? No, like it's a genre. There may be general tropes, but even within a genre, we see this all the time that people play with those tropes.
Yeah.
If you know what the tropes are, then people go, well, why don't I subvert expectation by inverting that trope or making you think that's the trope, but I'm actually doing something different with it. Like that's what happens with genre writing. You don't copy the pattern.
No.
You become aware of the pattern and you see what the pattern can do. You play with it. You experiment with it. And it doesn't mean that you have to like these films, although I think both Knives Out and Glass Onion are brilliant.
Yeah,
But
me too.
um, again, some of the commentary has been, oh, but it didn't do this thing, and this is what must be done in a mystery. And I'm going, oh, you idiot! I can think of film versions
Yeah.
of Agatha Christie that did this, and you're complaining about it. Oh, but it's nonsense. And
Yeah.
part of this is, I think, we have an increasing reliance and shrinking down of expression in cinema. Fewer voices, fewer different types of films that are being experienced because the domination of the box office by big franchise movies. And a lot of films that would have been made in the past are no longer being made now, not because no one wants to make them or no one wants to write them. It's because financing isn't in place for it, because you don't have the box office release and then the international box office, then the DVD sales, and then the selling the license to network TV, where you get some money back even then from advertising revenue and stuff, or from the network that's showing the film. No, it's in the cinema, and some of them are straight to streaming. And suddenly that what used to take about 2 years of revenue slowly coming in for film has just a lot of it's disappeared.
Yeah.
And because of that, a film that is a riskier proposition, there was a chance, even with a risky proposition, that it would make it back over time. It would make it back on DVD sales. It would make it back on being sold to a network TV station. Now that's not an option.
No.
And so why take the risk? You have a sure thing that you bet on, or at least something that you think is going to be a sure thing.
Yeah, it's interesting that I know when we watch, we go onto Netflix and watch. We're watching Polish, Italian, Spanish, German productions, television productions, and we have noticed French as well. We've noticed just a jump in quality. I think since Netflix started actually funding these countries and their own filmmaking and televising productions. And maybe that's sort of one area where we're starting to see inroads being made on that kind of monolithic Hollywood stance that has been driving so much of our entertainment these days. I'm just seeing some really good stuff, and well produced.
And again, I think part of it is there is an assumption with certain types of, say, Hollywood films or even TV shows that they underestimate the intelligence of the audience.
Yeah.
Because of that then becomes the norm, in which case that's what the audience comes to expect. So when you do something different, the audience doesn't have the experience. Even if they have the intelligence, they don't have the experience anymore to understand and read the film. And yet
Well, yeah,
when there's
and
respect for the audience, when you have that, when you have character writing and that sort of thing, where it's no, we're not going to talk down to the audience. We're not going to assume that they need an action sequence every 5 minutes because they can't sit still. Suddenly, you get really interesting film and television.
yeah, I experienced it firsthand with the initial rejections of Gardens of the Moon from the U.S. publishers, where they told me that the book was too complicated for their audience. And the irony is, to this day, I sell more books in the States, more copies of Gardens of the Moon in the States than anywhere else. So it just was not the case. But you know, when you're trying to sort of make your way through that narrow gauntlet, publication or production, you're going to run into these belief systems that are in place regarding the audience, and it can be an obstacle for a lot of creative people.
But again, if you want something to be a commercial success, you go, well, why not sell to the lowest common denominator? Like aim for the biggest possible audience. And you go, well, if you're doing that sometimes, you're lowering the literacy level for a start because you want to be the biggest catchment area possible.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you make it slightly more straightforward. You can still have great stories that work for all ages. I'm not saying that you can't, but if that's what it becomes, and then someone goes, well, but I want to do this thing. It's, oh, but people aren't going to understand that. No, seriously, people understand James Joyce's Ulysses. I'm fairly sure they can work out Gardens of the Moon.
Yeah.
It's like, oh no, but people who read fantasy would never understand complex things. You're like,
that's the other implicit assumption going on there. Yes. Yeah.
And I find that frustrating that it is now almost a de facto an author or narrator must hold the reader's hand and spoon feed them all the information because, well, readers now expect it. You go, yeah, we've gotten lazy. The number of people who have reacted to things like Knives Out and Glass Onion, and you see their reactions and you go, no, it's because your ability to understand the narrative has atrophied. You've been fed narrative for so long, you don't know how to chew for yourself. And it is a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
But what do you do about it?
Not much. I'm too old for it anyways. Can't be bothered.
Well, I think, part of what we do is we highlight fantastic works to go, listen, what narrative can do, what you can do with writing, what you can achieve, the effects that you can create are almost infinite.
Yeah, and that's what I love the most. I mean, we could probably do Grendel maybe next as a possibility.
Oh, that'll be a fun one. I'll have to see if I can find an easy way to mount it.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a good one. But anyway,
that's a good one because Gardner then in one of his books he deconstructs it, and so I remember reading that and just being blown away. So I can probably paraphrase Gardner a fair bit for that. So,
okay, well, Steve, thank you very much for joining me. It was a pleasure.
That was fun.
And for those of you still watching, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.